So we're going to talk about birding Harney County. How many of you have been out there at least once to bird the area? Okay, I'll talk a little bit about some stuff that people who haven't been out there might be surprised. But this is one of the main reasons that people go out there, particularly if you go in April. This is a male sage grouse, or sort of doing what he does to become the alpha male and attract the most females. They form a lek, which is a circle, and the alpha males in the middle, and the lesser males are scattered out in the circles around him. And the females have to try to fight their way to the middle to get to the alpha male. This probably was one of the junior males because he was near the perimeter when Peter took his picture, because you can't get out of your car and you can't run into the middle. This lek, by the way, is gone, but there's still dozens of leks scattered around Harney County. This happens in April. So some people like to go birding out there and look for the leks. By the end of April, early May, they are starting to hide, and you rarely see them along the roads unless you get really far back from the farms and ranch houses. Once they're done lekking, they get pretty secret. Even though they're a good-sized bird, they're almost as big as a wild turkey. The Paiute lived in that area. They didn't travel around much. They would travel within the basin and sometimes go up into the mountains to hunt, but basically they lived near the lakes down in the bottom. And there was a pretty good variety of food available there. And obviously they had to put up with the mosquitoes. The first serious birder out there was an Army surgeon. Ben Dyer was typical of his era, the late 1800s. There was a guy by the name of Spencer Baird who ran the Smithsonian. And he just happened to be the son-in-law of the quartermaster for the Army. So he would interview all the doctors that came through Washington and the Army. And he'd find the ones that knew something about natural history. And he'd go to his father-in-law and say, why don't you assign that guy to Eastern Oregon? Why don't you send that guy to southeastern Arizona, places where there weren't specimens yet in the Smithsonian collection. So Ben Dyer got sent basically by the Smithsonian to Eastern Oregon at a time when no birder had ever collected anything in Eastern Oregon. And he was the first serious ornithologist in the valley. Not too long afterwards, William Finley, who has a little reserve named after him just down the road here a bit, he was the leading ornithologist in Oregon at the time, ran around with big box cameras taking pictures of things. And he and his friends quickly realized that Klamath and Malheur were really important for waterfowl. So he took his lantern slides back to the White House, made Teddy Roosevelt sit down and look at them. And as a result, Roosevelt named them the first 2 inland wildlife refuges in the United States of America, thanks to William Finley. And there's a little plaque in his honor at the headquarters. Malheur is a natural basin. For those of you who spend any time in the Great Basin, or if you've read McPhee's book, Basin and Range, you know there are huge the climate changing. I'm sure we all read the articles. Great Salt Lake is just about gone. It used to be the largest inland lake in the western United States, and now it's vanishing. Malheur Basin in wet years has 3 lakes. It has Malheur, which then overflows into Mud Lake, which then overflows into Klamath Lake. Mud and Klamath Lake have been dry now for several years, and they've become basically grassland and sagebrush. And whether or not they'll ever get water again, your guess is at least as good as mine, maybe better. There are 2 rivers, 2 basic large rivers by Eastern Oregon standards that flow into Malheur Lake. One comes down from the north, that's Sylvies. The other comes down out of Steen Mountain to the southeast of the basin, and that's called Donner and Blitzen. Everybody calls it Blitzen just to save the time. And the name comes from, it's thunder and lightning. An Army general who was out there with troops, I think in the 1840s, got caught in a thunderstorm, and he named the river after the thunderstorm, Donner und Blitzen. This is what it looks like. There are the lakes up at the top. The only lake that exists now is Malheur. I checked recently. It's at about 20%. of surface area. So its normal surface area is almost 50 million. It's around 11. Pardon me, 50,000 acres. It's around 11,000 acres now. It's usually fairly shallow all across. So as it gets bigger, it may get down to 1.5 feet deep in the middle, but it's mostly 4 inches, 6 inches, 2 inches. And even the carp population has really, really plummeted, which is a good thing long term if the lake ever refills, because the carp were brought in by some morons who thought it would be a great idea that they could raise carp in the lake and fish them and make fertilizer out of them and do whatever. And of course, they completely destroyed a lot of the environment once they got there. They're not native. And most of the refuge is south of the lakes along the Blitzen River and its valley. Steens Mountain is the tallest point east of Mount Hood in the state of Oregon. It is a fault block. So when you get two big pieces of rock pushing against each other, one of them goes up, one of them goes down. And so the east side of Steens Mountain drops 5,000 feet straight into the Alvord Valley. It's one of the tallest cliffs you can find anywhere in North America. This is the west side that slopes down into the Malheur Basin. It's very gentle. It's constantly rising, but it's not generally very steep in any particular place. And the snow will stay usually, certainly into July. Sometimes the road will open by early or mid-July. But if you go out there in April, May, and June, you can't go up to the top of Steens because there's too much snow. The road's still closed. Stegner told us that the key characteristic of the Western United States is aridity. And it's certainly true in Harney County. Burns, the average precipitation is less than 11 inches. So most of the water that ends up in the lake out there is coming out of the mountains. It's snowfall that melts and runs down the rivers. Sometimes there's too much. I took this picture on the right in 2011. There hasn't been a flood since, but I was on Rue Red Road, if you know the area. It's flat. It runs out east from 205 and up toward Lawin, which used to be a town. And this is what it was like. You look right off the edge of the road, and it was flooded all the way to the lake, which is way in the background, and there's Steens Mountain out there. Thousands of acres were underwater that spring, and the wind was blowing, so foam was coming in off the water, and it was blowing in all the drowned spiders and pieces of mice and insect eggs and grasshoppers and stuff on the edge of the road. And you roll down the window, and there's a Franklin's gull, and there's a godwit, and there's a bunch of killed. They were eating. It was a cafeteria along the side of the road because the foam was bringing in all the good stuff, and all the predators were lined up right next to your car along the side of the road. It was the most magical thing I've ever seen in a flood. This is what it looked like. The Sylvies River just covered most of the farmland southeast of Burns. These are the guys that like it when it's dry, and they're doing quite well now. Last September had a field trip. I have never seen that many sage thrashers in flocks. We'd see flocks of 40 or 50 sage thrashers because most of the wetlands have become sagebrush. So the habitat for them has multiplied greatly in the last few years. And of course, the pronghorn, as long as people don't build too many fences, the pronghorn do really well in dry areas. These are three other very important characteristic creatures out there. The badger, of course, probably the lead digging predator in much of Western United States. There's at least one female who raises her babies on the campus now at the field station. She's been under one of the dorms now off and on for years. Of course, this long-legged character on the right is a daytime owl, a burrowing owl, and they're quite common in the dry parts of the basin. And this is the now famous nest site at milepost 17 on Highway 205. These are ferruginous hawks. These are the 4 youngsters. This was a few years ago. Last year, they only raised 3, which is still pretty good. That nest that you see there was several years ago. It collapsed last winter. So Rick Vetter and a couple of other birders went out and built a new platform. And within 2 weeks, the ferruginous hawks were putting sticks back on it. So that tree, it's the only juniper within a mile in any direction at milepost 17, is Ferruginous Hawktown. And I'll show you some picture, or a picture we took last June when I did my photo trip out there. But this is a great place. If you like Ferruginous hawks, you can spend all day there watching the nest behavior in May, June, and into early July. This is a picture from the photo trip in June. What you've got going here, this is we spent about 2.5 hours there, and 90% of the time we're just standing around telling stories, watching the babies yawn or take a nap. And every once in a while, mom or dad would show up with a piece of meat and action would happen. That's a Western kingbird. They were nesting in the same tree. This is a Western kingbird on the back of an adult Ferruginous hawk, grabbing its feathers and pecking it on the back of the head. Now, we couldn't see that. We could tell there was harassment going, but the camera could show us what happened, because the camera is about 10 times faster than our brain and about 50 times faster than our eyes. And of course, it's two Brewer's blackbirds, but they're just sort of going along to scream and yell. But it's the kingbird, and that's why they're called tyrant flycatchers right there. That's clear evidence that they've earned their name. And this is another picture on that trip. Another thing you can't see with your, you know this is happening. You know the nighthawks are flying around at 40 miles an hour, swallowing bugs that are going 6 miles an hour. But you can't see it. You just, in your mind, you know it's happening. This is a camera probably shooting 150 frames a second. It got it 1 nanosecond before that bug was swallowed. So the photo trip, and I do it in June for 2 reasons. This is one. The nighthawks come in, they're the last nesting bird that comes back. So they come at the end of May because they starve to death if there's not a lot of insects in the air. They're not going to go like a barn swallow and go get stuff off a lake. They're not going to get stuff off the ground like a nuthatch will if they're really hungry. They have to catch insects in the air. They can't walk, they can't run, they can't perch, but they can fly at 50 miles an hour, and they can see these bugs with these huge eyes of theirs, and they outfly them, of course, because the insects aren't very fast, and swallow them. So they need a lot of insects in the air. When they first get back, they haven't made it yet. They don't have a nest. It's all about eating because they've just flown 1,500 miles over the last couple of weeks. So they're building up their body strength to get ready to mate and raise young. And so they're in the air in flocks in the daytime, like purple martins. And it only lasts for a few days. Then they mate, they go out in the sagebrush, lay their eggs on the ground, hide, come up in the evening, come up in the early morning, hunt all night, but you don't see them in flocks of 300 at noon on a sunny day like we did. So it's only that little window in June when you can see these nighthawks doing this stuff in bright light. And later I'll tell you about the other reason why early June is so good. Lots of colorful names out there. Yellow-headed blackbird's extremely common. Blue-winged teal, of course, not very common, but a regular breeder in small numbers. It tends to be more of an eastern species. Cinnamon teal, very common. Some years, it seems like they even outnumber the mallard. And these are some of the birds that you will see and enjoy when you're out there. Upper left, Swainson's hawk with that tiny little beak. He's a bug eater. So he can't stay in the winter. He's probably down now over the Andes eating dragonflies. Franklin's gull, white pelican. And the Franklin gull is one of several species that you're almost never going to see on this side of the Cascades. I mean, maybe 1 or 2 will show up sometime, but you could bird for years around here and never see one of these guys. You go to Malheur in the spring and summer, and there they are. Beautiful birds. This is one of the great experiences. The white pelicans that haven't been able to nest on Malheur Lake because of the drought last few years, but still show up in the dozens. And you see these whirlwinds or these tornadoes of pelicans circling like this. Sometimes they'll get 400 or 500 yards up in the air. And when they lean the right way, those wings turn silver, the white part. It's just absolutely incredible. Second biggest wingspan in America. Only the condor has a slightly longer wingspan. These guys are almost 9-foot wingspans. So when they get up in the air and they're soaring on those huge wings, you almost never see a flap. They make turkey vultures look like hard workers. This was one we had last September. This is a very dark morph, Swainson's hawk. And there was almost as dark morph on the next crossbill. So we think this was a parent. The other one was clearly youngster, didn't know what he or she was doing. But this was the adult. We couldn't believe it. We spent about 20 minutes watching this bird, and it was watching us. But there are a lot of both Swainsons and Ferruginous as well as redtails. So you get all three of the inland bootios in pretty good numbers there. No red shoulders. They don't go that far east. There's a Ferruginous, aptly named Buteo regalis, biggest wingspan of any buteo on the planet. Huge gape. When you get a good look at it, the mouth comes all the way back here. So he can get a ground squirrel and just swallow it whole. Red tails pulling pieces off. These guys just, thank you. Ferocious birds against other raptors. None of the other buteos even bother to go close to them. They tend to nest like that one nest in isolated trees, so you don't see them in forests. You see them on a small tree, usually out there, junipers, occasionally a cottonwood or a willow along a creek, surrounded by open land. And they stay all winter. This is the tallest bird in Oregon, sandhill crane. It's an adult. They usually come back in early April. They've had a hard time in the drought. Last September, we saw 7 pairs. Only 2 of them had a third with them. So that meant the other 5 pairs had not bred successfully. The year before and the year before that, so 21, 22, there was almost no evidence of any young sandhill cranes. They need wet ground and a lot of food. They dig their food and they get it on the surface and under the ground. So if the ground bakes and there's not very many voles and there's no insects and the frogs can't breed, these guys can't breed either. Now they live a long time, so lose a year or 2 of breeding is not going to destroy the population. But if the drought and the climate change continues, they're either going to leave Malheur or the population will die out. There's a couple of, this is typical crane behavior. They dance both to keep the family together and also to create their territorial possessiveness. For those of you who love cranes, by the way, I'm doing a trip to Sauvie Island in January. It's the northernmost wintering population of cranes in North America. And I'm a craniac, so I can't wait to go see them again. We did a trip in November and they were all over the place. They put this stain on, we think, as a camouflage because the gray really shows up. The pale gray in summer really shows up against green. So what they do is they get mud and they rub it on their own feathers and each other's feathers, the adults. And the iron oxide and the iron compounds stain the feathers. That's sort of rust color. So they don't show up as much against the green when they've stained their feathers. So in the fall, when you see 3, which is usually what you see, mom, dad, and the kid will not have any stain on his feathers. He or she will be gray, but mom and dad will still have some stain left, particularly if it's September, October. By this time of year on Sauvie Island, they've started to molt a lot and most of the stain is gone. So it starts by spring. By March, you can't tell unless there's a good size difference between the youngster and dad. You can't really tell who the youngster is. But in the fall, the stain tells you that's the adults. Trumpeters have not bred since 2017. I talked to the PhD biologist who has really been studying this for a long time. There's no clear evidence that they were native to Oregon, that they would have been here 200 years ago as a breeding bird. They would have come maybe on migration in the winter to places like this where the water doesn't freeze. But they were brought in an attempt to help the trumpeter swans spread around North America. And we're breeding fairly regularly. When I started going out there in the early 2000s, you'd see 3 or 4 pairs with at least 1 or 2 cygnets. But the last time they bred there is 2017. The only pair in the state that bred last year was at a private preserve near Prineville. Canvasbacks are relatively common, one of the many breeding birds that you see when there's wetlands. These guys are one of the easiest birds to find, which is kind of odd. Around here, finding great horned owls is a pretty good job, but there they nest every year at headquarters. 2 years ago, they failed to raise any young because the drought had killed off almost all the little rodents. But last year they raised 3. They had a pretty wet winter. And we'll see what the season's going to be like this year. But there's always a pair at the headquarters. There's a pair that nests every year at the field station next to the old gymnasium. There's usually a pair somewhere along Greenhouse Road. Last 2 years, they've nested in a big cottonwood right next to the road. And they're fairly common wherever there's large cottonwoods. In a couple of places, we've seen them in cliff faces, down around milepost 46 on Highway 205. But they are, as we know, the alpha predator at night. These guys are in charge. Nobody messes with a great horned owl. There's one of the kids this last summer. There's 2 of them cuddled up. One of the interesting things you notice, they're not the same size. Owls are one of the few species that start incubating the minute they lay an egg. So they lay an egg on Monday, mom sits on it. She lays another egg on Friday, and she lays another one the next Wednesday. So that's the way they hatch. So they're in sequence. They're not all hatching the same time like a robin or a crow. They hatch in sequence with the born. So there's always the big one, the next biggest one, the little one, and the littlest one. That's not always good for the littlest ones because he or she may not get enough food. Interesting, and I'll just throw this in because it was fascinating when I started doing it. When I wrote the Great Gray Owl book, it turns out they feed the little ones first. Because some years, the kind of habitat they live in, particularly when you get up into lemming country, there's a population of food one year, the next year it crashes. So the year there's food, they have to raise them all because the next year they may not even lay an egg. So for them, they try to raise as many as they can every year. These guys go for the strong ones. Cranes do the same thing. Cranes will lay 2 eggs, raise 1 baby. These guys are really common on migration and also breed in the willows along the Blitzen River and Sylvies River in the basin. But there are times in May when you would swear there's 5 million yellow warblers in the county. This is the other reason you like to be out there in early June. These are bobolink. This is almost the westernmost place these guys breed. Certainly the westernmost place in Oregon where they can be depended on. They're a member of the blackbird family. They have a voice like a redwing, but their song is about 3 times as rich and longer. And this is the male with his white down the back and his little platinum gold head. This is the female. So their male and female are as different as they are in redwings. But when these guys first get back in late May, it's all about courtship and territory. And when it warms up enough, you know, if you go out in an early morning in May and it's 45 degrees, you're not going to find them. But the minute it hits about 60, they're out, they're fighting. We spent an hour and a half in the Diamond Canyon one morning watching 3 males fight each other. One would get up in the willows, start to sing, the other guy come and knock him out. They'd chase each other. They were screaming at each other, flying across the road at eye level. I mean, it was a fraternity party. These guys were drunk with testosterone. And that only lasts for a short period. The minute they find a female, they start building nests. They hide back in the willows. Maybe you'll see one come out and grab a bug, but they're not going to behave the way they do in early June. By late June, these guys are as secretive as a marsh wren. But there is that period in June when the nighthawks and the male bobolink are insane, and that's a wonderful thing to watch. Sage sparrow is the largest, along with the lark sparrows, largest of the sparrows. Dry country, of course. That's where the name comes from. They're now called sagebrush sparrow because they split it into 2. There's a bell sparrow that's in the southwest, and these guys are up here in the north. Beautiful singers, and they have those bold white eyebrows. Black terns are the smallest tern in this part of North America, where we don't have least terns, and they're mostly bug eaters. They will occasionally, you'll see them hit the surface, but they don't catch big fish. They're just the opposite of a Caspian tern. So they're flying around like swallows and swifts, hawking insects. This is at the fishing pond, which is just west of Burns on Highway 78. It's not an elegant, beautiful little park, but it stocks it with fish, and obviously it's good for insects. And this was a day in May when something was hatching. You could see the little flies coming up, and these guys were gobbling them up as fast as they could. And those are our canvasback there in the background. Now this guy, I can't say enough about this guy. The nighthawks are, as I said, are the last birds to come back. They have tiny little feet that they use to clean their feathers. So they can't walk, they can't perch. They have to land on the flat surface with their belly. They have a tiny little beak in the front. You'll see that later. But they have a huge mouth. So they fly around with the mouth open, getting bugs in there. And there's little spikes in there. And every bug that goes in gets spiked. And when they get enough spikes full, they'll sit on their belly, swallow the bugs, and then go up and do it again. And they've got about a 15-inch wingspan on an 8-inch body. So the big wings, and they got white bars right in the middle of their wings. So when you see them up in the air, they're unmistakable. Very sharp, pointed wings like a falcon, but they fly like swifts. Here's the mouth. There's an insect, spiked. The beak is just a tiny little thing on the front. Again, it's used for preening. Completely the opposite of, can you imagine a great blue heron trying to survive with a tiny beak? It would never make it. These guys use their beak for cleaning feathers. That's it. The mouth is what does all the feeding. Horned larks found in dry areas, not so much in sagebrush, but dry grassland. The shorter the grass, the more they like it. They're pretty common around Chickahominy, which is a refuge south of or west of Riley. Franklin's gulls have seemed to have survived the drought. They bred this last year pretty well. During the really dry parts, when the lake got down to 500 acres, they did not breed, but they did last spring, and so we're hoping they'll do it again. Small gull, size of a bone apart. So they're the smallest of the 3 gulls. The other 2 gulls that breed out there are California and ringbill. Wilson's Fowler rope. Male on the left, female on the right. Very important to know that this is one of the few bird species where the female gets to look good and the male sits on the egg, so he has to look drab. So she's the beautiful one and he's the pale gray one. So she goes around and lays nestful, and a male has to take care of the babies and raise them. So she gets the fancy feathers. They actually have 2 legs, but they don't always show them both. It's Wilson snipe. In May, they're quite common in the wet grasslands, and they love to sit on the post, the males, and sometimes they'll even call for you. When they get up in the air, of course, they do that almost owl-like, they do, and they do it with their wings. You think it's vocal, but it's not. It's wing whirring. There's another one. See where the eyes are? Fascinating thing about this bird, it has to feed with its beak in the mud. And when the beak's in the mud, the eyes are up here, it's got 360 degrees. No harrier is going to sneak up on that Wilson snipe because he can see 360 when he's got his beak in the ground. The other important thing about birds like this, it goes true with coastal birds like godwits, the tip of that beak is absolutely amazing. It is a sense organ you cannot believe. It's your nose, it's your finger, it's your tongue. It can taste, it can smell, it can feel. They'll send out vibrations. You've seen godwits do it on the beach if you've ever seen them. They feed like this. They're sending out vibrations. If it hits a shell, they go over there and eat it. It's almost like radar, except it's vibrations in the sand. These guys do the same thing in the mud. So the tip of that beak is absolutely incredible. Ibis, again, same thing. Very, very sensitive tip of the beak. Ibis have done really well. They were fairly uncommon there 60, 70 years ago. Now there's thousands of them. They love, of course, wet land. They've had a little bit of a hard time in the drought, but they can always find water somewhere, even if it's just along the rivers. And there's the, you can see why it's one of the dumbest names in the bird world. barely a little white circle around the eye. That's how it gets the name whiteface. What it should be is shiny green ibis, because when the sun shines on them, they're iridescent. Curlew, largest shorebird in North America. Serious territorial when they're breeding. They take no guff from any hawk that comes by. They'll knock them out of the sky. They get up above them and scream and say, "I'm going to stab you, buddy." I saw a curlew chase two young prairie falcon. He chased them about 10 miles. They were screaming. He was never going to catch them because they're faster than he is, but he was not going to let those little buggers go because they'd flown over his nest. Sunset and sunrise are important times for the coyote. You'll hear them both morning and evening. Mountain bluebirds, not in the basin. Good place for them is Sage Hen Rest Area, which is at about 4,800 feet, and it's juniper and sagebrush. So, and you see them up on Steens Mountain as well. They like open juniper forest. I think they're allergic to water. You're never going to see them within 50 yards of a cattail. These guys were introduced for hunting. California quail, we could call them Oregon quail because we have a lot of them around. And I think there are a lot more of these than there are people in Burns. You see them running up and down the street. You see them sitting on people's porches. They're everywhere. And they like people because they know that you're going to shoot at them if you're out in the open. They're pretty common at the field station. There's now a bird blind on an old volleyball court at the field station, and they keep it water drip. And if you go out there in the morning, there'll be anywhere from 5 to 50 quail coming and going and eating and getting a drink. These are the introduced species out there. These are chucker here on the right. You tend to see them in places where it's really rocky. I've seen them at Diamond Craters, see them along 205, where you're driving by the cliff faces and there's rocks that have fallen down. That's the kind of habitat they like. Page Springs, if you've ever been, I challenge anybody to come up with a more beautiful campground anywhere in the world. The Blisson River runs between these basalt cliffs, huge cottonwoods, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 springs coming up out of the ground that flow year round. And this is why you go there for your birder. It's the only place you know you're going to find yellow-breasted chat. And in the spring, they will come out and call you a variety of names and sing you all kinds of melodies that they've written themselves. They don't listen to the radio, they do it themselves. And we now know that they're actually closely related to the blackbird family. People used to stick them in with the warblers because they had the yellow chest, but all you have to do is listen to them one morning and you go, that's not a warbird. This bird really sings. Got more voices than any other bird this side of the mockingbird. Ross's geese come through in April and then come back in September. They're on their way north in April. Of course, they go up near Hudson Bay to nest. Gets pretty ducky starting in April, and then a lot of them stay and breed. Others, like the buffalohead, keep going further north. But there are a lot of ducks in April and May. Pintails breed there. One of the more common dabbling ducks in the Malheur Basin. Buena Vista Ponds, when there's water, can tend to have 10 or 12 different waterfowl breeding there, everything from piebald grebe and coot up to large dabbling ducks like pintails, mallards, and shovelers. This is the view. You're looking up at Steens Mountain. So this is in the spring when there's still snow up there. These guys nest fairly commonly, mostly around people. They nest at the field station. I'm sure if you've been watching the articles, you realize the population is plummeting for kestrels. A little bit of it might be climate change. A lot of it's chemical because they catch things on the ground and in the grass. So any place where there's commercial agriculture, these guys are not doing well. But there's always a pair at the field station that gets to hunt in the sagebrush. I thought I knew mourning doves. I've been seeing them since I was a kid. And once I started birding, it's that sort of drab little brown bird with black spots. But up close in the sun, they're iridescent. This is the only time I'd ever seen one that had been mist netted. Look at those colors. Wow. but they're fairly common out there. Lewis's woodpeckers don't nest in the basin. They do nest in the mountains north of Burns. They nest up at Idlewild and Joaquin Miller and up in the Blue Mountains. And when they come back in May, they, like their cousin, the acorn woodpecker, they're in groups. And there'll be a gang of them. And sometimes there'll be as many as 50 or 60 of them in the trees at headquarters or at Benson Pond. That's where we took these pictures. They had probably just arrived the night before. They wouldn't even fly. You get within 5 feet of them and they just sit there going, leave me alone. I had a long night and I'm resting. And there's one in pure sunlight. The only woodpecker in North America with no white. The only woodpecker in North America with pink. And iridescent. The colors on the head will change depending on the angle of light, but handsome birds and fairly common up in the Blue Mountains. And when they come through in the spring, it's quite a show. And of course, they're great flycatchers. If you've ever been around them, their behavior, they'll fly up like waxwings or some warblers and catch things in the air, very unlike most woodpeckers. White-headed woodpeckers are only in the mountains up north. And up on Steens Mountain in the Aspen. You're not going to see them in the basin. They don't migrate, so they stay up in the mountains all winter. So you're not going to see them down at headquarters. It's one of the few places in Oregon where you find both kingbirds, both the eastern and western. Of course, they divide out by habitat. The eastern bird, he's used to water, so you find him along the rivers and the creeks and in the marshes if there's willows around. And the western kingbird is perfectly at home out in the dry land, hunting in the sagebrush, wherever. I've never seen them within 50 yards of each other. But have the same size, same aggressive personality, the same I'm in charge, get out of here, I'm a kingbird. Say's phoebe, quite common. They nest on the porches at the field station. They nest usually at least one or two in the buildings at the headquarters. Like black phoebes, they're pretty at ease around people as long as they've got a roof over their head and a place where they can stick their little mud cup. And fairly numerous, certainly more common than the kingbirds. Tanagers come through, they don't stay in the basin. They go north into the mountains. But when they come through in spring, they're in full breeding plumage because they're going to start nesting as soon as they can mate and get a nest going. Pretty good variety of wrens. They have marsh wrens, rock wrens, canyon wrens, no Buick's wrens. There's the warbler again. And again, they're in breeding plumage when they come back in May. So the males, got the little red spots down the chest. They're ready to go. And they can be incredibly numerous when they first come back before they split up and start nesting. And a lot of them that come through go much further north. This is a yellow rump warbler that had been misnetting. And so we were looking at his wing spots. And there you see a little bit of yellow in his crown. And they come through in pretty big flocks in the spring too. A few of them will nest in the mountains further north. This is a bird that is common both in spring and fall, not very often nesting in Harney County. But I talked to Duncan Everett, who ran the field station for years, a professional ornithologist. He estimated that millions of these birds come through Harney County in the fall from the tundra. They're on their way to California, and you literally can walk out in the sagebrush on like September 10th. It's like being in a popcorn popper, except every piece of popcorn is a white-crowned sparrow. They're just up and down, all over. They come through in the millions. So in September, this is probably the most numerous bird in Harney County for a period of 2 or 3 weeks until they get further south, then they start splitting up. Some of them will come here, some of them go to the coast, and millions of them end up in California in the lowlands. Red-winged blackbird, they're common. They're year-round. This is a male showing you his wing patch. These guys are also quite common. Some of them stay all year. Many of them migrate out. But when they're around, this is a feeder at the headquarters. They're dominant. They're bigger than the other blackbirds. If there's trouble finding nesting, these guys get the best nest spots. I've seen places like a Klamath Basin. These guys take the cattails. The redwings are nesting up in the pine trees because they can't get in the marsh. These guys won't let them in. There's one. He was very upset at us. Fortunately, I didn't understand what he was saying, but I'm sure it was pretty adamant and probably angry. Meadowlark, state bird, very common in the dry lands out there. One of the few birds, and you've probably noticed this if you bird much, one of the few birds that will sing in the winter. Buick's wrens will sing, and these guys, you can go on a sunny day to Basket Slough, it'll be 28 degrees, the sun's shining, he'll sing. He may not sing as much as he does in the spring, but he will sing year round. Great musician. Glad that he's our state bird. Avocets, they nest there in pretty good numbers, so does their cousin the stilt. Least chipmunks, smallest chipmunk in North America, they're pretty common in the open areas. You actually don't need trees to find these guys. You see them all over running around the field station. 4-inch body with a 4-inch tail. And here we are, yellow-bellied marmot. They build these big mounds of sticks, and they also like rocky hillsides because they can hide under the rocks. Pretty common, and they'll whistle at you if you get too close. Deer, coyote. The coyotes have suffered quite a bit in the drought. Population's way down, probably because the rodents population has dropped. There's a coyote going across the field. Pronghorn doing pretty well. They can take a fair amount of drought, unlike some creatures. It's very important for them that the fence, the bottom of the fence line, be at least 16 inches off the ground. Unlike deer, they're not related to deer. They're not related to African antelope. If you've been to Africa, you've seen gazelle. They can fly. They'll go along, all of a sudden they'll take off and they don't land for 15 feet. These guys can't jump. They have to slide under the fence. So if he's going 50 miles an hour and he can't get under the fence, it's all over. So if you want to save the pronghorn, and many of the ranchers out there do because they also hunt them, they raise the bottom line of the fence. So if he's going really fast, he doesn't see it till he gets close, he can go underneath. Can't jump. Has no near cousins. This is a survivor of an old family of animals. Does anybody know why they're the fastest animal in North America? Yeah, they had to get away from the cheetah when we had cheetahs. They outran the cheetah and outlasted him. Cheetah's gone, pronghorn's still here. Nobody can run as fast as pronghorn in North America. This is fall, Dean's Mountain. These are the aspen turning yellow. This is falcon foolery. One spring, Albert and I found a prairie falcon nest along Harney Lake Road. There's a series of cliffs. And this is 2 of the 4 youngsters, and they were flying. They were, 17-year-olds out on their car, except these guys were in flight. So they're fighting each other. They're attacking their dad from behind. They're screaming and yelling and having all kinds of fun. These are the guys that got chased by the curlew, by the way. He did a whole bunch of pictures for the Oregon Birding Association, but this is just an example of what they were like. And this guy is in charge. This is the boss, golden eagle. Nobody messes with a golden eagle. This is 2 on the nest on the same cliff face where the prairie falcon nested the next year. This is one in flight. These birds hunt in the daytime. They get harassed a lot by smaller, faster creatures, of course, because their strength is their strength. They're not fast. They're not sneaky. They're just really powerful. And if they grab something, they get it. And I've seen them being attacked by smaller hawks, osprey, red tails, Swainson's hawks. And if they get really upset, they don't fly away, they don't hide, they don't try to dodge it. They just turn over and go, okay, come on down. Because this 750 pounds per square inch, they can grab a young coyote or a jackrabbit and they just crush its spine. And it's dead instantly. So nobody messes with the golden eagle in any serious way. They harass them a lot, but they don't want to get too close. And this is what it looks like at sunrise. And if you got any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Thank you. I wrote the book to help support the field station, so they get the money from the sales. There's only one copy left, but they've got it at Wild Birds Unlimited, or you can get a hold of me and I can sell you one, or you can get one at the field station and the headquarters. The Friends of the Wildlife Refuge are selling them too at the headquarters. But if you got any questions about Harney and birding and whatever, let me know. Yeah, I lead 3 field trips. There's a thing back there, a handout. I do 3 trips, May, June for photographers, and in September. But if you just want to go on your own sometime, I'd be happy to give you advice on where to go, when to go, what to expect. One of the things I try to lay out in the book is particularly the birds that we don't see often in urbanized parts of Oregon and California and Washington, the birds that people go out there for, the bobolink, the Franklin gulls, when and where to expect those birds. Because there's a lot of birds, Wilson's phalarope is another one. You might get a Wilson's phalarope on migration somewhere in the valley once in a while, but you're not going to see them in breeding plumage swirling around in a pool next to the road. So when and where and how to look for the birds that are real specialties out there is what I really focused on. Plus, I got a map in there where the gas stations are. Those of you who've never been, one of my favorite signs is south of Crane. As you're heading down toward Field, it says next gas station, 88 miles. I tell people if they come on the trip, never go to bed without at least half a tank of fuel in your vehicle, ever. One guy said, oh, I'll get some when we get back to the Narrows. He pulled in the Narrows, he needed diesel. They didn't have any diesel. He had to go into Burns, took him an hour and a half, and he missed dinner. He could have filled up in the morning, but he was too busy. Paid the price. Yeah, gas is a big deal out there. Yeah. I stay at the field station. You can stay, there are motels in Burns, and they're just exactly what you'd expect. Marginal places that don't charge very much. There's some decent places to eat in Burns. I stay at the field station for 2 reasons. One, they're a nonprofit and I want to help them. 2, you're on the refuge. It's the only place I know of in the Western United States where you can legally sleep on a wildlife refuge and wake up in the morning and there you are. You walk outside your door and there's the quail, coyote calling, there's a nighthawk sleeping on the porch or on your car. You don't get that if you stay in a motel in Burns. And there's also the campground at Pay Springs. Later in the year, after July, there's campgrounds on Steens Mountain up above 7,000 feet. And there's an RV park about 2 miles from the headquarters called the Narrows that I know people like. They use it a lot. It's got a cafe and laundromat and showers and stuff. So there are other places. And if you ever want information about it, I'd be happy to talk to you. There's 2 historic hotels that are still in operation, one at Diamond, one at French Glen. People can stay there. Neither one of them are cheap, but the food is good and the setting is ideal. So if you want advice about it, just send me an email or give me a call or whatever. I'd be happy to talk to you about the options. But I stay at the field station partly because I lead trips for them, which they do to raise money to keep it going. It was built by LBJ and the Great Society for inner city kids. And then Nixon defunded that. So the universities took it over as a research station. Then we defunded the universities. So they dumped it and a bunch of birders took it over and started a nonprofit to keep it going because it is unique that you can stay overnight and wake up in the morning on a wildlife refuge. Can't do that anywhere else that I know of. Yes. Yes, particularly if you're going to the field station. I suspect if you're not going at a high point and you just pulled into Burns, you could find a motel room because there's several motels. But I would, if you're going at a high point, either the Bird Festival, anytime in May and early June, make reservations. Yeah, because there aren't a lot of options. And particularly if you want to use one of the hotels, they're both old. They call them, what do they call them? Drover's Inns, which means they were the whorehouses for the cowboys. So they've only got a few rooms. You're not gonna find a four-floor hotel with 120 rooms. There's nothing like that in Burns. There's only 7,000 people in the whole county. But the area is bigger than Delaware, Rhode Island, and Connecticut combined. So it's very sparse, and what few things are there, you want to know where they are and where to get them. There's one Safeway in the whole county. So if you don't take food with you, that's where you go. There's a Safeway in Burns, and that's it. And it's not open 24 hours. So my advice, if you want wine, take your wine with you unless you're going to Diamond, because we tried to buy wine once at the French Glen store. They didn't have any. They went all the way into Burns, got some, and we picked it up later in the day because we stopped in the morning on the way down, came back in the afternoon. She'd gone all the way to town and back to get wine for us. So, you know, think what you need and make sure most things, other than simple things like batteries, take it with you. Anything else? Anything from the chat or anything? Nope.
You titled your talk "Challenges of Birding Harney County." What are the challenges?
Well, the challenges are knowing where to go, when to go. Things are pretty well spread out. You know, it's 35 miles from the headquarters to French Glen, and then it's another 3 miles to Page Springs. The loop, the Steens Mountain Loop, is 55 miles. So nothing is close, nothing is obvious. You know, it's not like going to Minto Brown, where it's all within a few thousand acres. It's hugely spread out. And there are hot spots, and you want to know where they are. Benson Pond is great. Crumbo Lake can be either good or bad, depending on the time of year and how the birds are behaving. And of course, it varies year to year. Sometimes you go out Rue Red Road and Lawin Road, there's a big marsh like there was last spring, and there'll be ibis and ducks. You go the next year, if it's dry, there's nothing out there but horned larks and meadowlarks and a few shrike. So you really need to know the area, and you need to know the what's going on in the season. Yeah. No, that's the other thing. Even the maps that you look at, whether they're online or paper, will not necessarily agree. I found one road that had at least 5 different names, depending on what source you were using. There's one road that goes northwest out of Hines up into the Blue Mountains. And for a couple of miles, it's called the logging road of such and such. And then it's got a forest number, service number, then it's got a BLM number, then it changes its name again. So you really want to know where you're going, and you absolutely cannot depend on your cell phone for anything. There's places where the cell phone doesn't work. The maps on your cell phone are probably going to be wrong. The first thing I learned this years ago working on freeway birding, Google Map will lie to you. Google Map depends on aerial photos. If you go into a forest, it says the road goes all the way through. Guess what? There's a gate just after the trees start. But Google doesn't know that and will never tell you that. So you absolutely want to know where you're going. And paper maps are still the most dependable thing. Once you're out of the main area, paper maps are still your best choice, because what's on your phone is probably not right.
You say that because we always
Well, you know, the younger generation are completely, they think everything's on the screen or it doesn't exist. But send them to Malheur and they'll learn. Yeah. I try to list all the names. I warn people if the name changes. There are places where a map will say this is the name of the road, and then you get to the intersection and that's not what they call it on the road sign. And the other thing is there are huge areas, you know, this is Eastern Oregon, folks. This is rural Oregon. There are whole areas where they do not put up road signs. They put up a road sign, it gets shot down the next day. So they just don't do it. There's a place where you turn onto Smith Creek Reservoir Road or something like that. It's way south of French Glen on 205, but you're heading toward Fields. So you're 20 miles from getting into Nevada. And there's a main dirt road that goes west from there, and it goes all the way across the mountains, all the way to Lakeview. So it goes into the next county. It goes for miles and miles and miles. As soon as you turn off the paved highway onto the road, there's a big sign saying, no more road signs. That's it, folks. You're on your own. And your cell phone doesn't work. So you'd better have a map or know where you're going, because that road goes for miles up into the mountains and down the other side, but there's no road signs telling you where you are. So that's another thing, even in the public land, and this is going through private land, which is why they don't bother to put up signs, but even the BLM land and the Forest Service land, a lot of times the signs are either gone or they were never put up in the first place. So you really want to know where you're going, and paper maps are still your best choice.
Judy says, thank you for your presentation. She loved the details on the species. If you go on a field trip with Harry, you're going to get so Stories like this. They're one of our best field trips because he's got stories about every bird. So I'd encourage you to go out with him sometime. It's quite an experience.
Yeah.
Harry knows a lot about birds and he really tells great stories.
Thank you. Yeah,
I picked up about it, Page Springs.
Yes.
I say a few things about it.
sure.
Okay, first of all, there is good cell service at Page Springs.
Oh.
And the other thing is it's pretty high demand. And
Yes.
you're really smart if you can get there before 10 o'clock on a Monday.
Yep.
Because people come in through the weekend, maybe a
Yep.
long weekend.
Yep.
And they'll leave on Sunday. I've been over there when I got the last space in the campground.
Yep.
And that can be kind of problematic because it's a long way back to town.
Yep.
Next to
Okay.
Page Springs Campground is a place called Steam Mountain Resort.
And then, and I was,
And they have trailers you can rent that they fixed up. They have a place you can hook up your
they have some
RV.
tents
and they
too,
do have some
or
tent
yurts,
stays.
I think.
Right, so that
Yep.
is another option
Yeah.
there.
You can, and you can reserve those.
Yeah.
I talked to the lady that runs that the last
Yeah.
time I was over there about
Yeah.
ice. And, yeah, I think it's a take your own bedding kind of place. But they have showers there.
Same thing with French, same thing with
Fuel station. Yeah, you take your own bedding,
They also have trailers and then they have the
dormitories.
dormitories.
Yeah.
yes.
I understand there's a couple of campsites at the field station now.
Yes, yeah.
And I've been thinking about trying to stay there.
Yeah.
The other thing is the lady at that Steve's Mountain Resort, they don't, like, you can't buy a shower there, but you can at the Narrows. So if you're camping at Page Springs, you can go to the Narrows and AFB and get a shower there.
And there also, if you're a desert person in the Alvord, there's one tiny motel at Field, probably 4 rooms. And there are both private and, yeah, right. It's famous for its milkshakes.
Good milkshakes at the Narrows.
Yeah. But there are both private and public campgrounds on the Alvord Desert.
I forget the name.
Yeah,
I stayed there once and there was nobody else there.
Yeah.
I had the place, me and the cows.
yeah,
When I go over, I usually stay at Chickahominy Reservoir, which is just west of Riley.
yeah. And it has good
That way I can
facilities for RV.
get Page Springs early in the morning.
Chickahominy has lots of hookups for RVs and camping. And if you're a fishing person, like some people we know, there's mostly fish. It went dry in 2022, but they have restocked it. And there were a lot of bird activity there in the spring and September of this year. And it can be the best place in the county for shorebirds in migration. I mean, I've had Baird sandpiper and stuff like that run around right on the coast and you can walk right up to the lake because it's all BLM. So total access. And it can be a really good birding spot for shorebirds and waterbirds. And it's also really good for horned lark.
Hansford says, he said, a lek was gone. You said a lek was gone now. Did you mean?
The one on Foster Flat Road, yeah, that was 7.5 miles up. Yeah, it's gone. Yeah, that area burned. Yeah. Anything else? Anyway, you got any other questions? I'll be around for a little bit. I have one book left. Oh.